Hello everyone, and welcome to my cozy little corner of Texas where I sit inside pretending it's not 100 degrees outside and sip coffee from my Luke's mug. It's been a month since I made my last video following my Rory Gilmore reading challenge, and in the course of that month I had time to order that cute mug and do some reading. The first book that I finished earlier this month was The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, which I discussed some in my last video and which I enjoyed. I actually listened to that audiobook narrated by Elijah Wood, but I don't really have a ton to add that I didn't mention in the last video, so we'll keep things rolling by moving on to the next one. The next book on the list was All the President's Men by Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. This was the first nonfiction book on the list, and I actually really enjoyed it. So for those of you who don't know, I think in my last video I mentioned that title is familiar to me, but I can't think what it was. I felt kind of stupid after I had said that because this is a very famous book, as are, I guess, all on the list. And of course I had heard of it, but just didn't connect the dots very well when I was chatting. So Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, as you probably know, are famous journalists, and they were both writers at the Washington Post during the Watergate scandal, and they are the two journalists who are primarily credited with breaking that story. In terms of craft lessons for writers, one of the craft choices that I found so interesting in that book was even though Bernstein and Woodward were the authors of the book and were essentially the protagonists, they wrote in the third person and referred to themselves by their last names. Since the book is not only about the events of the Watergate scandal, but also is about being a journalist, and it's about the journalistic practice and journalistic ethics and sources, and in that sense, their perspective, third person perspective choice worked really well because they were able to almost write about themselves as if they were writing a journalistic piece about someone else. And it gave them that journalistic distance while also, of course, being a very intimate description of their journey as journalists, since they had that experience firsthand. So it's an example of where, I think there are kind of some rules of thumb that you hear about when you're studying writing or when you're working with an editor, perhaps. They're like, don't do this, that doesn't work. And I think that playing with perspective is something that people will kind of say second person just doesn't work or in this genre or whatever. And I think that rules are made to be broken. And this is perhaps a good example of where, on the surface, I might have said I don't know if third person perspective when they're writing about their own experiences, I don't know how that's going to feel. It's going to potentially feel very forced, but it didn't. So a good example of when the craft choice matches the content and the themes of the work, then it can be very successful when done well. So I think that is an excellent example for any writers who are thinking about playing with perspective. And next was Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I had never read that, and I was kind of surprised just because it's so much around, and I love the movie, the Disney movie, and also, or I guess they're all probably Disney movies, but the newer movie as well. And I enjoyed reading it. It's wacky, and it's a little bit spooky, maybe a little bit dark in some ways, just because it's odd. And I do think that older children's stories tended to be a little bit darker than what we often introduce kids to now. But in my read through, I would say it's definitely suitable for kids, although it does have some eerie or haunting aspects to it. And, there is a little bit of violence. I don't think that the story really grapples with issues that are more mature than what you would imagine would be appropriate for the target audience. So, if there's families, kids out there who are wanting to read it and hesitated, I would recommend it. I think it's very fun, and that actually kind of points to what I often talk about with authors of children's books, that it can be easy to underestimate the complexity that kids can understand and enjoy in books. And Lewis Carroll does a really great job, I think, of inviting kids to like play with him and stretch their minds and their imaginations. He kind of commits fully to the bit of Alice going down the rabbit hole and, you know, experiencing this totally upside down world of imagination. And there's a ton of wordplay, tons of riddles. That's my craft takeaway from that book is don't underestimate your reader, especially kids, but even adults. I talk about this a lot with my other, reading friends, is like, you can expect me as a reader to follow and to do some mental work. And that's part of the fun of reading. And often, I think authors forget and want to kind of handhold. And so I think Lewis Carroll is a great example of an author who does not handhold for his readers. All right, next up on the list was The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon. This is a Pulitzer Prize winning novel and well deserved. I am a big, the cat is on the move. Let's see. Are you gonna disrupt the camera? Okay, he made it. We're all good except for a nice big scratch that I now have on my leg. Thanks, buddy. Well-deserved Pulitzer Prize winning novel. I am a Michael Chabon fan, but I had not read this book before, and I'm so glad that I did. And it was one of those books that as I was reading it, I started thinking like, oh, this friend of mine would love this book. Oh, this friend of mine would love, you know what I mean? Where sometimes you're reading a book and the further along you get in it, the more people you want to recommend it to. This was one. So the author is really fearless in the places that he takes this book. And so I think my takeaway as a writer is, especially when you're writing historical fiction, but really any fiction, if you see the story and you see the thread and you have the passion to connect them, that can be so exciting for readers, because I think surprise is the best emotion that a book or a story can possibly bring out in a person. And I love being surprised and by where a story goes, and I love being invited into niche communities and taking a look at, one of the best things about fiction is getting invited into a world that you don't already occupy, and this book really did that for me. I also wrote down, like, I cannot believe this isn't a movie. I don't think it is. Okay, the next book on the list was An American Tragedy. And this one was a doozy. I don't remember how many pages it is. I'll put that down here, but it took me a little while to get through. I was also kind of surprised that this book wasn't really on my radar, but it was written in the 1920s and I don't really want to spoil it too much for people, because the kind of main plot event, it takes a long time to get there, and it's kind of a will he, won't he for a lot of the book. But I hope, this might be a minor spoiler anyway, but as I was reading it, my main thought was, wow, this reminds me so much of Crime and Punishment, which I studied in school and which is also on the list. So I would describe this as an American Crime and Punishment. Very internal, kind of like watching or experiencing firsthand like the mental unraveling of a person in crisis. So this is set in upstate New York in the 1920s, and the character is kind of driven to desperation by a combination of his humble beginnings and the pressures of this sort of evolving American society where classes are blurring. The lines between classes are blurring, but some distinctions exist still very strongly and really determine the kind of opportunities that a person has. In much the same way that I remember thinking when I read Crime and Punishment many years ago, that it's very much, the problems and the crisis that the character is in are very much of his time and place. So because this one reminded me so much of Crime and Punishment while I was reading it, I've decided to, the next book on my Rory list after Anna Karenina, I think I'm going to read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment next. And I think that'll be fun to follow up after Tolstoy, get a couple of Russian novels in there, get a couple of the big boys out of the way, and then also because I think it'll be interesting to compare Crime and Punishment with An American Tragedy. Okay. And then another book I read this month was my very first Agatha Christie, believe it or not, and then there were none. So yeah, I haven't ever been much of a mystery reader, and I'm glad that one of my, it's not my first mystery book, but I really haven't read many, and I'm glad that early on in my journey I read Agatha Christie, and I can see why she's a master. The amazing thing about this book was its simplicity, and I think there's another Agatha Christie or two on this list. So we'll see if I'm right about this, but I think that what she does so well is decide on a simple, almost gimmicky premise for a mystery or for a crime, and then she just commits to it hard, but also then kind of packs complexity in by building a really rich and quirky cast of characters. So that was definitely my experience with this one, and I had so much fun. I actually listened to this one, and I had so much fun listening to it. I wasn't really trying to solve the mystery as I read, and I think that maybe part of that is my inexperience as a mystery reader, that I'm not really in that habit of, kind of trying to preempt the twist or kind of guess, solve it. So I just was like along for the ride. And when it came to the end, I was like, oh, I had a real fun experience of discovery. And I'm kind of glad that I wasn't, trying to like sleuth alongside the characters. I just was kind of letting them lead me where their suspicions were. So that was fun. So this, then the final book that I read this month on the Rory Gilmore list was A Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. I'm laughing because it annoyed the editor in me that on my list that I'm using, this was with the books that start with A. I think that when the author of this list compiled it, they were probably thinking Anne Frank. And so this got put with the A's, even though the title is A Diary of a Young Girl. But I went with it. And this is a book that I have read, and also, interestingly for me, was one of my mom's favorite books when she was a girl, and she's described to me multiple times how this book was really influential for her. So just from a personal perspective, it was really great to revisit it, and I kind of enjoyed imagining my mom reading it as a child, and knowing her family dynamics and her personality, and just kind of thinking about why did this book mean so much to her. Just on a personal note, it was really a powerful read for me. And what struck me is just how and maybe this sounds like a dumb observation, and people who have read this will be like, yeah, but it's just a diary of a young girl. Powerful in its quietness and its simplicity. Also, back to my note about kids and young people really rising to the occasion, like Anne Frank was fucking brilliant. She was so smart, and the observations that she made about the people around her and the books that she was reading, she's so smart and so thoughtful. For the most part, it was really, she was writing for herself. So it's tricky to take a lot from it in terms of craft, but there are, of course, so many lessons that a writer can learn from any piece of writing. And one thing that struck me as I was reading Anne Frank was how much reader perspective and readerly context matters. But of course, knowing what we know and having the perspective of a modern reader changes the meaning of and adds richness and meaning to all of Anne's diary, everything that she wrote. So I think it's just an important reminder. Once again, I think this is something that writers are reminded of often, but it can be easy to forget your reader, and to think about what context might someone be reading my book in, and who do I imagine reading it, and when and why, and what is going to encourage someone to pick up my book, and what am I going to offer them? What do I want them to take away? So those are the 7 books I read this month, June, July. As I mentioned, I took one little detour, which I'm actually still finishing this. But my friend and I went to the beach and we decided to read the same book together. We didn't finish it on our trip, so we still have to get together to chat about it. But she's a big romance reader. I encouraged her to choose the book, and she chose A Novel Love Story by Ashley Poston. So I'm like so close. I have like 20 or 30 pages left. So I'm just wrapping this one up, but that was one little detour that I took. Honestly, I'm not loving this one. I think my friend has enjoyed it a lot more than I did. So if this is a book that anyone out there was eyeing, I would still encourage you to read it. For me, it's falling a little flat. The premise is intriguing. So it's got a little bit of magical realism to it. So the protagonist is an English professor and a lover of romance novels herself, and she's in kind of a rut in her life and feeling lonely after a breakup, and all her friends are busy and stuff, so she decides to go on a little reading retreat vacation by herself, and she gets lost and ends up in a small town that turns out to be the small town from her favorite romance novel series. So she gets to kind of meet all of her favorite characters, and I'll stop there in terms of spoilers, but the premise was intriguing to me. And, the idea of having that, like, kind of following that thought project of that fantasy that I think any reader has had, which is like, what if I could visit this place and talk to these characters? Like, how much would I love that? And then, so I love the idea of that as a premise, but I just kind of feel like the author didn't take it anywhere unexpected. So instead of, she's kind of calling out all of the tropes in romance novels, but then instead of like playing with them, turning them on their heads, doing something different with them, she's just using them in her own book as well. So it kind of feels, I don't know, it's just, it feels a little flat and predictable in not fun ways for me. So that was my detour for this month. And this coming month, I bought my second detour book, which is James by Percival Everett. So I've been wanting to read this, And I keep seeing it on all the lists, and every bookstore that I walk into, it's like the table, on the table. It's the table. It's on all the, kind of staff recommended tables. So I've been wanting to read it. And then I realized what better time than now, because this is a retelling of Huckleberry Finn from the perspective of Jim, the enslaved and formerly enslaved man who travels with Huck for a lot of that book. So since I just read Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, I thought now is the perfect time, because I kind of have the characters and the plot events and everything fresh in my mind, and will be a fun opportunity to experience the retelling. So it's I'm really looking forward to this, and as I said, it's been widely acclaimed. So I'm going to be checking that one out soon. And then in terms of the Rory list, as I mentioned, I'm going to read Crime and Punishment next. And then, hang on, I got to pop up and look at my next few books. Okay, so next on the Rory list, there's some heavy hitters. So there's the Archimedean War, The Art of Fiction, The Art of War, lots of art is coming, and some Henry James and Norman Mailer and Sun Tzu. So some heavy hitters. We will see how that goes. I'm gonna try to do justice to all of them and read every page, but we'll see. I might not force myself through every page of The Art of War, but maybe I'll enjoy it. Who knows? So I do have a couple vacations planned, so I might kind of bop around on the list a little bit to find a few things that might be a little bit lighter for like airplane reading. But I'm definitely gonna do Crime and Punishment and James. And then gonna try to keep plugging through the A's. Oh yeah, and there's one other one that I'm waiting for the audiobook from that was in the A's too, Angela's Ashes. So another light read. But yeah, I'll probably listen to that one because I think I'm up next soon on Libby with that one. So yeah, wish me luck, and I will be back on in a month to give you another update, and hopefully everyone else is enjoying their summer reading, their summer travels. You can see the top of the cat whiskers right at the bottom of the screen. That's so funny. Are you saying hi? All right. Ta-ta.